Yeah, thanks for joining us. And we want this to be fun. We want this to be interactive. Maybe it'll go like 45 minutes. And let me just kind of start out with something that I think most of us know. How many people have played Monopoly? Could you raise your hands, please? Just kind of raise your hand, either, virtually or with okay, so quite a few people. Let me share a picture. So not this one, but this one. The Fed is about 100 years old, and yet America has been around since the 1770s. Before we had the Fed, there were powerful bankers like JP Morgan. You've heard of Chase. And the Monopoly Man is kind of based on JP Morgan. So the Fed helps control banks, it helps control the economy, it helps do all sorts of things that we really care about. So that's sort of a little bit overview of what we're going to expect here. So I know that, being in the business school, you have to take econ, you have to take accounting. Maybe you thought it was boring. Maybe you didn't really see how it fits with real life. But after this little presentation, and certainly after the Fed visit, you're going to see how the Fed impacts Main Street. That's kind of our main purpose here. It helps impact inflation, which, is certainly in the news. It helps with employment or unemployment, getting a job. And ultimately, it's going to help with your future. So we all have money in our wallet, hopefully. I know a lot of people carry credit cards and Venmo. You might wonder who's in charge of the money. Well, it's the Fed, right? You remember the Jerry Maguire movie, Show Me the Money? Well, that's what the Fed is, right? Show me the money. Now, when you take macro, at least when I took it, they talk about this thing called the Phillips curve, and the Fed is sort of focused on this. There's usually a trade-off between employment or unemployment and inflation. It's good for people to have a job. We want people to have a job. But if everybody's spending like crazy, it results in a lot of inflation. Now, the inflation numbers came out today is around 2.4%, but if you go back about 2 years, like 8 or 9%, it was kind of crazy. And one of the things with the tariffs is that there might be more inflation. So that might be a good question to ask the Fed, how the whole tariff situation might impact inflation. But the Phillips curve says there's a trade-off between inflation and employment. So the more people employed, then maybe inflation goes up. If people are unemployed, you spend less, and then inflation goes down. So the Fed is always trying to strike a balance. And we'll get into the numbers, but just some rough rules of thumb. Usually the Fed wants inflation about 2% per year and unemployment around 4%. Um, it's impossible to have 0%. I can give you one example. Let's say there's a lot of openings to be a nurse. Well, it takes training to be a nurse. So there's like a mismatch of skills and other things as well. But step one, all that money we see in your wallet, everywhere, show me the money. The Fed is in charge of that. Now, Mark and I just kind of alluded to the tariffs. This is like the big thing. If you follow financial markets, and I encourage you to do it, you might remember during our little visit, we showed you some websites like CNBC and other things as well. And part of what's going on is that we run a persistent trade deficit with these countries on the left. And President Trump wants to have a balanced budget, balanced trade deficit. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. One is to either devalue the dollar or appreciate these other currencies. Another way is to get them to buy more things. A lot of the markets we try to sell in, there's restrictions. We're not able to sell there. So there's a lot going on. And as you can see, it's created a lot of volatility. I mean, yesterday, the stock market went up 9.5%. That's pretty much what it does in a year. It did it in one day. And if you get in your finance classes, this thing called VIX, which is a measure of market psychology, and you can see how it spiked up over the past couple of months over this tariff deal and inflation. So, make a long story short, it's a great time to take a visit to the Fed because of all the turmoil that's going on. And the Fed is right in the middle of it trying to manage it. And you can see here, ripped from the headlines, the Fed, You may have heard that the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. A lot of currencies are pegged to the dollar, Hong Kong dollar, for example, and then others try to stay within a band of it. The Fed also received some criticism for maybe being a little bit late to the party in recognizing inflation a couple of years ago. So these are just kind of real-time things ripped from the headlines. And the Fed has a tough challenge between inflation and a slowing economy. One of the things we're going to ask you, we have a poll. I don't know if we're going to do the poll today, but we're going to come back another time after our visit and talk about what the Fed will do. And the chairperson of the Fed, his name is Jerome or Jay Powell. And they're going to have a meeting in May. And one thing they can do is change interest rates. Primarily, we're going to talk about short-term interest rates. And right now, they've been holding rates. But if the economy falters, they may want to reduce rates. But conversely, if inflation goes up because of the tariffs, they might want to raise rates. So at this point, it's a little bit of a coin flip what they'll do. And we're going to get your opinion. And then sort of like betting on a sports event real time, we'll sort of see what the results were. The Fed possibly could say, we're going to be on hold right now, but their tone, their guidance, what they say gives you an idea what the next move will be. So let's say you're playing a game of poker and somebody says check. Well, they're either trying to bait you or maybe they don't have a good hand. If somebody says I'm going to raise, they probably have a good hand, but they could be trying to bluff a little bit. So the guidance matters as well as what the actual decision is. So, Jack, are we going to be able to launch the poll here, or are we going to do that another time? Should I click on this link or
I think it's
We
going
do
to
it
come at
later.
the end.
at
So
the
we're
end?
going to do a series of this will come up. We'll
Okay.
launch the poll and
But
we'll come
this is
back.
the preview. We're gonna go to the Fed next week, but then we want to get together on May 8th. On May 6th and 7th, the Fed meets to decide what they're going to do with rates. Before that, we'll have everybody submit what they feel the Fed will do. Then on the 8th at 7:30, Professor Longo, and then a person from the Fed who I know, Matthew Lieber, is going to come and speak to about the Fed. And also he'll field questions about career opportunities and give career advice to the students that attend. And I think you'll enjoy that session.
Yeah, thanks, Jack and Mark. I'm pretty sure that after our visit, we're going to kind of write an article on the Rutgers website. We'll show some pictures. And in this article, we might say, here's what the students said, and here's what the results were. So uh, stay tuned on that. We're going to expect some positive publicity. And as Mark mentioned, you can put this on your LinkedIn profile. Like I said, I'm in my 50s and I've never been to the Fed. So I think it's pretty cool. So the Fed has five main jobs. We'll briefly go over these. One, it conducts the nation's monetary policy. It controls the money. And as we'll discuss, money kind of impacts inflation, other things as well. Now, you may also know I put up the thing of Monopoly Man and JP Morgan on purpose because the Fed is the banker to the banks. Before that, we had people like JP Morgan that had to step in. So every bank, or at least the large banks, are controlled or monitored by the Fed. I know you were alive in 2008, 2009, but you may have read about the world financial crisis. And a lot of the major banks, banks that we know, Bank of America, others, were in danger of going under. So the stability of the financial system is something the Fed does. It sets rules, it tweaks things. All of us have made payments. I hope someday soon you'll have a checking account if you don't do it, if you don't have one now. Maybe you've heard about somebody sending a wire. Uh, you probably use Venmo. There's probably plumbing beneath the surface there that the Fed is involved in. And then they have what's called a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We'll show some pictures of that. That the Fed and its parallel agency, the SEC, they're designed to help protect the small investor. So, bottom line, all these five roles directly or indirectly affect things that you and I do on a daily basis. Now, there are regional Fed banks. So, there's one here in New York that we're going to go to, one in Philadelphia, there's one in Denver, there's one in San Francisco, Chicago. So, there's a board of governors that helps manage those banks. There's 12 regional banks, and then there's a committee. The committee is the one that helps set interest rates. So people kind of rotate on and off the committee, and the committee meets 8 times a year. And as Mark and Jack alluded to, when we do this poll, that's sort of like what the FOMC does. You know, they lower rates, they keep the same. What guidance do they give? The Fed is a bank. And as you know, a bank has a balance sheet. At some point early in your business career, you're going to take a class in accounting. If you haven't had one in high school, you probably heard of a balance sheet where assets are on the left-hand side, and then claims to those assets, liabilities, and equity are on the right-hand side, and the balance sheet has to balance. Let's look at the left-hand side. The Fed owns primarily US Treasury securities. And then I mentioned the kind of financial crisis that happened in 2008, 2009. The epicenter was real estate, and real estate is backed by mortgage securities. So the Fed bought a bunch of mortgage securities, and they have some other things as well. So in terms of what they owe, well, we mentioned the money that's printed, that's a liability. Banks keep money at the Federal Reserve just so they don't go under, so they have some financial stability. And unfortunately, the Fed actually has a negative net worth. This rolls into the US government. So all of us on this call are richer than the Fed because even if you don't have a positive net worth, you don't owe $200 billion. So this is our a little balance sheet. It just shows you some of the things that the Fed is involved in. The Fed is focused on monetary policy. You may have heard of the term fiscal policy. That's the power to tax and spend. So this is Congress on the left, and this is the Fed on the right. The Fed is quasi-independent. It is independent, and it's a quasi-government agency. So Jay Powell, each governor on the Fed has a long term, about 12 years, which lasts beyond any presidential term. So it's supposed to be kind of independent, but obviously they report to Congress and everyone else. But just to make it clear, Congress is focused on taxes and spending, while the Fed is focused on interest rates, money supply, and indirectly kind of inflation and jobs. Okay, so the Fed has two main goals. If it had a report card, these are the two main things that you look at. One, stable prices, low inflation. They put a number on that, 2%. Let me ask a question. Why do you think the Fed doesn't want inflation to be 0% or even less than zero? Because, on the surface, if prices are falling, they'd be cheaper for us to buy things. So anyone want to, you can unmute yourself or type something in the chat window. We'll try to have fun with it. So stable prices, definitely, inflation around 2%, but, why not zero or why not negative? Anyone want to take a guess with that? Okay, no comments so far. Well, part of it is population growth, right? So population is slowly increasing, 1% per year or so. And you also don't want to create an environment of like very tight money where people panic. So this is one reason why they want a little bit of inflation, but not too much. The other thing, as I mentioned, is maximum employment. And maximum in the Fed's context is generally around 4%. And we're around that 4.2%. And yeah, thanks for adding something in the chat window. Yeah, there's no demand. So, you want to have kind of a balance of supply and demand. But these are the two things the Fed is worried about. And today, as we speak today, this is one of the most challenging times for the Fed because tariffs might increase inflation. And simultaneously, a lot of people are panicking because they don't know what's going on with, tariffs, and it might slow down the economy, which would increase unemployment. So this is one of the more difficult times, I'd say, in the past, decade. COVID was tough. We'll talk about that, but the Fed has. So as we mentioned, the specific goal of the Fed is to have inflation around 2%. It helps lubricate the economy, helps account for population growth, make sure that money isn't tight, that people aren't panicking. And, here's sort of a question, should the Fed be concerned about inflation? I kind of answered that. I think they should because of the whole thing with the tariffs. I'll give you one example. Let me ask this question to the group. Maybe you can type in the chat window or you can just volunteer. How much do you think it costs to produce a pair of New Balance made in America sneakers? So, rough estimate of how much that sneaker costs without kind of Googling it. Like, we all know you can buy a pair of Nike sneakers, $40 through a few $100. What do you think this made in America New Balance sneaker costs?
Probably a couple hundred.
Excellent guess. Yeah, it's about $200. So it might be great to have some factories producing sneakers in America, but do we really need everything produced in America? Yeah, I don't think so. So certainly maybe things like national defense, you can argue about these AI chips, but I don't know about you. I'd rather pay 50 or $60 for a decent pair of sneakers than 200. So this notion of tariffs and inflation, it really gets to the heart of, what we do. Yeah, great guess about $200. All right, so as we mentioned, the Fed's second kind of goal or part of its report card is to have almost everyone have a job. And, we can get into the weeds a little bit how this is measured, but they survey people, are you employed or not employed? And what might surprise you is that even part-time employment is considered being employed for this survey. So like if somebody's driving an Uber cab or something, they're considered employed. So there's another measure, it's called U6, that measures underemployment. That is, do you have a job that you're reasonably happy with? And that number tends to be a lot higher. So as I mentioned, the economy is slowing down. GDP has been increasing at 1% this quarter. We like to be around 3%. So the Fed, in theory, would lower interest rates to speed up the economy. But if you lower interest rates, as we saw at the Phillips curve, it could increase inflation. So there's a term you may have heard of called stagflation. We're not quite there yet, but stagflation is when the economy shrinks and inflation goes up. And that's certainly within the realm of possibility, right where we are now. All right, let's move on to the second role, promote the stability of individual banks. As I mentioned, banks have gone under. You might have heard of the investment bank, Lehman Brothers. That was the biggest bankruptcy ever. There was a bank not too long ago called Silicon Valley Bank on the West Coast. They had to be bailed out. There was a pretty wealthy bank, at least at one time, called First Republic Bank. They had some problems, and J.P. Morgan snapped them up. So, a lot of banks go under. They make bad loans. They don't manage the risk of their portfolio correctly. So the Fed is involved in that. We've had Rutgers students get a job as a bank examiner. It's a pretty decent start. You get to learn a lot. And then often one of my students was a bank examiner for the Fed, and then he got a job at Goldman Sachs, which, as you know, is a premier Wall Street firm. The third one is to promote the stability of the financial system. So what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. It means that banks have capital on hand. They could survive a run where a bunch of people show up at the window and want their money at the same time. They have a diversified portfolio of loans, not all real estate. Like you might know that commercial real estate's in trouble after the pandemic. A lot of people didn't go back to work. So commercial real estate's in trouble. Certain regions of the country can be in trouble as well. So the Fed is kind of looking at all that. So here's a little example. One bank that increases apartment loans in a city, that's okay. But if everybody does it, everybody's copying each other, that creates a systemic risk. And that's what the Fed is sort of trying to prevent. Four, fostering payments and settlement system. This is, all of us send money back and forth. And something sort of fun, maybe you've had like a ripped $1 bill or $5 bill. You might wonder what happens with that. If you bring it to the bank, they take it, and then the Fed kind of destroys it and maybe puts a new one in its place. I mentioned electronic funds. Maybe you've sent something on Venmo or PayPal. There are other things. You may have heard of something called an ACH. So bottom line, if you might remember from our kind of ways to save money, one is don't use stamps. A stamp is approaching $1, right? That's a lot if you have all these bills. So if you do an ACH, that basically circumvents using a stamp, and the Fed is beneath that. So I would think about it as the Fed is helping run the plumbing of the financial system. It monitors the plumbing. There's a lot of institutions involved in that plumbing, Visa and MasterCard and other things. But yeah, they're running the plumbing of the payment system. So here's something cool. So first of all, maybe you never looked at this. It says Federal Reserve note at the top. So that's one thing that, in case you wind up on Jeopardy. The second thing, in case you wind up on Jeopardy, is I mentioned there's these regional banks of the Federal Reserve. This one is the New York Bank. But if this one's a B, if there's like a D, it means it comes from Denver. We have anybody that's a coin collector here and maybe noticed any of the kind of symbols on the coins that are printed? I know when I was a kid, I collected coins a little bit. So yeah, Jack, you did. Have you noticed like the little thing next to the quarter or wherever it tells where it's minted?
Yeah, I have. And I was always into the states, filling out the map with all the
Yeah,
quarter.
cool. Yeah, you buy the booklets and try to get each state. And yeah, so, the Fed is behind that. The Fed is literally printing it. It, it's not shown on the slide, but you've probably known that money has changed over time to make it more secure and reduce the risk of counterfeiting. And the last one I mentioned, they're involved in protecting the small investor, the small saver. There's something called the Consumer Protection Bureau. You might have heard they also often reinvest in communities. So this is something that the Fed helps do. I mean, let's face it, the rich person, they're advised pretty well. It's the Main Street investor that needs help from the Fed and also the SEC, which is more involved with issuing securities. Right, so we talked about fiscal policy, power to tax and spend, and then monetary policy, what the Fed is focused on. So the Fed has two main tools. One is the Fed funds rate. This is the poll that we're going to do near the end. This is basically short-term interest rates. But the Fed can also influence intermediate to long-term interest rates. So you might know that US Treasury securities, they go out all the way up to 30 years. So they have a portfolio of bonds that we alluded to on the balance sheet. And this portfolio of bonds helps impact the intermediate to long-term interest rate as opposed to the Fed funds rate, which is the short-term rate. And they're all relevant. Something like a 20 or 30-year bond might tie to the mortgage market, while a 5-year loan might tie to a car loan. And then like your credit card is tied to the short-term rates. So here's the Fed funds rate. You can see before you were born in the 1980s, interest rates were super high. They were like in the teens. And then not too long ago, we had rates around 6 or 7%. And right now they're about 4.25%. So this is the short-term rate. If you put your money in the bank, for example, you may have heard of a bank CD, certificate and a deposit, not compact disc, even though most people don't have a CD anymore. They kind of stream their music. So bottom line, the interest rate that you earn if you have a savings account is primarily tied to the Fed funds rate. It also impacts borrowers. They add a spread on top of that because the banks take your money that you put in the bank and they lend it. That's their business model. That's how they make money. and they pay a spread. Prime lending rate is the rate that the banks give to their best customers. So they pay something more. And if you have a poor credit rating, you'll pay something much, much higher. So bottom line, the Fed is tied to both saving and borrowing. Maybe you have a student loan or something like that. Believe it or not, the Fed's sort of behind that. As I mentioned, the Fed has a portfolio of securities, and you can see during the Great Recession, they bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities, and then they sort of got rid of some of them. Right now, the bulk of the Fed's portfolio is held in Treasury securities that have a short-term maturity. So they need to kind of, you know, manage this very prudently because if they dump it all in the market at the same time, interest rates would spike. Conversely, if the market slows down, they can buy treasuries, and that injects money into the system. So a lot of money has to be rolled over, and this will tie into the government debt that we get into in a moment. Okay, so as we mentioned, they own mortgages. They didn't do this really in the past, but the mortgage market was sort of collapsing. So they did buy a bunch of mortgages, and it did help low interest rates. So the house I'm in doing this webinar when the kind of COVID recession was going on and the Great Recession, I refinanced my mortgage to like less than 3%. Today, mortgage rates are like 6 or 7%. So it's a good deal if you can do that. As we mentioned, this is sort of the balance sheet, and they trade not only US government bonds, but also mortgage-backed securities. Okay, so this is what I mentioned before Lehman went under, before the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, the Fed just mainly owned US Treasury securities. Then they bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities, and they're slowly trying to get rid of some of these. Okay, so roughly speaking, the Fed can have what's called easy policy, easy money, or tight money. And you might say, why would you ever want to have tight money? Well, what if inflation is running out of control? So as we can see here on the left, if the unemployment rate is too high or inflation is too low, if we have negative inflation, we call that deflation. If there's deflation, businesses make less money selling their goods. They make less money selling their goods, they lay off employees. So low interest rates are good, but negative interest rates, not good. So when these two things are happening, high unemployment or inflation too low, the Fed has an easy money policy of lowering short-term interest rates and maybe buying some of those bonds that we talked about. Conversely, if the unemployment rate is too low, that could ignite inflation. And if inflation is too high, that also creates a risk. So the Fed could raise rates. It was doing that a couple of years ago. So we call that tight money policy. As we mentioned, there's a ton of debt out there. And as I mentioned, the Fed is part of the US government. It's sort of independent, but it rolls into the US government. And we have a lot of debt out there. And, we need to kind of have a balanced budget and other things as well. And the best way to deal with debt is growth. So like, let's say you have a student loan, the best way to deal with it is get a high-paying job and pay off your debt. So the Fed is, in the weeds in this, involved with it. And you can see the US consumer, unfortunately, has been spending more and more. So certain debt might be okay, right? If you're taking on a loan to go to Rutgers, that's probably okay because you'll have a positive return on investment. But taking on a lot of debt just for consumption, it's probably not great. And you can see the country as a whole, we've sort of binged on debt. And this is not great. And the Fed is trying to help manage this. And, here's the question, how do you know if you have too much debt? I don't know, anyone want to take a stab at that? How do you know if you as an individual or the country as a whole has too much debt?
Maybe the interest payments on that are exceeding your revenues.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent response. We hope you never get in this situation, but I think we've all been there at one point where you have a credit card and maybe you don't have enough money to pay the bill in full. but you should have enough to pay the interest, as your classmate said, as the minimum payment. Similar to the US government, does a tax revenue have enough to pay off the interest on the debt as well as any debt that has to be rolled over? So the bottom line is that whether you're an individual or the country, which is the sum of all of our spending as well as the government, you need to have debt under control. And frankly, it's been getting out of control, and that's why there's a lot of turmoil going on. This is the US government. This is not this one's total debt, private sector, and this is the federal debt. Usually, anything greater than like 60% is not good. You might remember like 5 years ago, like Greece was in trouble. They were on the ropes. And their debt was sort of like this, like 120% of GDP. So this is not so good. It results in higher taxes. Um, a lot of the debt we have to pay with government bonds that results in interest. So the interest on debt is now more than 10% of the federal government spending. It's like just money going up in smoke because they're not building anything with it. It's just interest you have to pay. Okay, so there's a problem. It snowballs, especially when rates go up. We call it the carrying cost of debt. So let's say you owe $100. If interest rates are 5%, that's $5 a year. If interest rates go up to 10%, that's $10 a year. So there's both the amount of debt you have and the interest rate. So it can snowball and get out of control. And you can see here, consumers, one of the things we've been trying to teach you in this kind of club is to kind of spend, live within your means. It's kind of tough as a student because you don't really have much income. But once you start working, you want to find a way to live within your means. And you can see the average person in America, it hasn't been trending in the right direction. All right, so you were in high school or maybe near the end of junior high during the whole COVID thing. And does anybody remember some of the things that either the Fed or the US government did? They're sort of intertwined, so we'll just kind of open up to the group. Anything do you remember the government did to kind of help keep the economy moving during that time? Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, excellent, Joseph. So, and thank you, April. The main thing that they never did before is they literally sent a check in the mail to a lot of families. That never happened before. So Trump sent some checks, Biden sent some checks. I don't think we're going to get a Doge check, but that could be in the mix. SBA loans, so SBA Small Business Administration, a lot of businesses were literally shut down by the government. There was nowhere to go. So the Fed and Congress, they gave money. So it was really a tough time. And let's face it, it was a tough time. My heart goes out to anyone that had people that were sick or passed away from this. But it's amazing that we did bounce back pretty strongly after this, once in a century type pandemic. Okay. So what would Jay Powell do? And, you sort of answer that on the fly. They lowered interest rates. That's one thing they did. They sent checks in the mail, the small business relief. And it was it's hopefully a once in a lifetime thing. Okay, we have a poll here, Jack. So
It should
you've
be showing
launched
up on
on that.
everybody's screen. We'll give you a
Yeah.
minute to answer, and then
Okay.
once I see about 18 responses, I'll show you guys your results.
Okay. So yeah, COVID hits. Let's go back in time to 2020. What do you think the Fed should do in terms of interest rates? Right, Jack? I guess you're kind of recording the
Yeah, here I'm gonna share with everybody
okay.
results now. So, John, I'm not sure if you can see
Yeah,
it.
I can see that. So great. You had the right answer. As we mentioned, if you want to speed the economy up, you want to make interest rates lower, it makes it cheaper to get a loan, to lease a car, student loan, mortgage loan. And yeah, so, overall, usually the majority has the correct decision. So 1 for 1 for the group. As we mentioned, among the things, I mean, it's not only the COVID payments that increased the debt, it was just a lot of other things. Government spending, maybe tax receipts were down because people weren't working as much. I know there was sort of a bailout to some of the transit agencies, like nobody's taking the New York City subway or New Jersey Transit. Those institutions are running a large loss, and we had to subsidize that. So bottom line, we have this snowball of debt that is sort of getting out of control a little bit. All right. So another thing that happened is there was a supply shortage. We have another question here. So I guess we have here with the Fed, with interest rates, with the federal debt increasing, what would the Fed do in order to, I guess, keep the interest payments down? Would they want to hold rates steady or increase rates? Okay, I guess we'll let you
Almost there. We're at
give a
14.
response.
Another second. All right. Let's see.
Yeah, definitely hold steady. So, I guess it's a toss-up right now between hold steady and cut rates. Clearly, if you want to reduce the carrying cost of debt, you'd want to hold it steady or lower rates. But if you're worried about inflation getting further out of control, you'd increase. So I guess the question wasn't quite as clear, but there are a range of options that the Fed has based on where we are. Now, this one, you kind of probably remember a shortage of things. You might remember there's a shortage of masks and 95 masks. There was a shortage of computer chips that went to cars and some other things. And you can see these trucks were kind of stuck at the docks. There was a strike for a while. So these supply shortages generally could increase prices, right? Increases inflation, kind of supply and demand. If the supply shrunk and demand stays the same or actually increases, it results in rising prices. Okay, this looks like the same poll as before, unless it's a different. Uh, I'm seeing another poll up here, Jack. I'm not sure if there's another question that we haven't answered here.
This is the case where there's high inflation, and what does the Fed do?
Oh, okay. All right. So let's say inflation surges again because of the tariffs. What do you think the Fed should do? Increase rates, cut rates, or hold steady? So this is almost the opposite of the COVID question, at least when the economy is collapsing.
Yeah.
I'll start waiting for 5 more responses.
Okay, inflation's going out of control. What would you do?
One more. There we go.
Well, if inflation is out of control, you got it right. Increase rates, right? That would kind of slow down the economy, put a damper on spending. And that's what the Fed did. And that was a couple of years ago. And now they could be back in that situation with the tariffs. Okay, we're almost done. This is I guess, the last poll or the link on what the Fed is going to do in May in terms of interest rates. So,
Yeah,
Jack, can you walk us through? Is there something we could put in the chat window, or they have a link
I
to?
will drop that link in right now, and we'll also have that sent to you guys so you can do it ahead of that May 7th meeting. And when we reconvene, we can look at what you guys thought.
Yeah, so this is a like a real-time question. What is the Fed going to do at their May 7th meeting? We'll take our poll now and then we'll kind of revisit after the meeting and chat about it. And that's sort of the last slide that we had. We hope that you learned something about the Fed and how it impacts all of us. This is kind of a summary. I don't know if we can maybe send this list to the
Well,
group. We can, if you want to
yeah, we'll
comment
send
on it,
it to you
Mark.
afterwards. Yeah, we'll send it to you. As you know, in all our classes, we have a short list. So we want to summarize what the takeaways are, and we'll send this to you. We'll give it to Miyoki, and she can send it to you.
And this is, so that's the end of our formal remarks. We're happy to answer any questions you have. And one legitimate case of using AI, and I even typed this in myself, is what questions could you ask a senior executive of the Federal Reserve if you were taking a trip there? So, you can try that out. As Tess said, we hope it's an interactive dialogue where you're asking them questions. And let's face it, they don't expect you to know a lot. You're freshmen, you're coming in, so don't feel like any question's dumb or anything. Any question is good because we're just trying to learn about how the Fed impacts Main Street. So that's kind of the purpose of our trip. And, we're going to take you out to lunch after. I don't know if we're going to be able to do this, but we're hoping to see the gold. There's almost $1 trillion worth of gold in the building that we're going to. That gold is partially owned by the US government. It's owned by foreign governments. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We can't guarantee it, but I'm hoping it's something we can do. And as you might guess, they're not going to let us take pictures of it, but we could say, you stood next to almost $1 trillion worth of money. Mark, is there anything else you want to add? I mean, we're happy to, take any questions you have at this point.
Yeah, I
We
think
hope you have fun with it. You want to dress professionally.
you should just look at it as an opportunity. When I grew up, I didn't get a chance to go to the Fed, and I haven't been there, but it's a unique experience, and we really appreciate the Fed letting us come there. And again, we're gonna go next Friday, and we'll send you the short list from what we presented today, and then we'll plan to get together and we'll have lunch after we visit the Fed, and then in May we'll reconvene, have you guess or estimate what the Fed will do, and then we can speak further about it.
Great, thanks.
And just for all students, another note again, you are expected to dress professionally next Friday. So if anyone has any issue with that, please reach out to me ASAP so that we can assist in any way possible. Of course, you need to have a valid government ID with you next Friday in order to enter the building. I would hate to have you all get on the bus and travel with us to New York and not be able to enter the building. So please remember to bring that with you. Transportation will be provided by our office. We will have two pickup locations, one in Newark and one on the New Brunswick campus. So you don't have to worry about transportation. Again, like he said, lunch will be provided for you, so you also don't have to worry about covering lunch. All you have to do is show up on time, and of course, you'll receive those details from me about what time the bus will arrive on each campus and where you are to meet us in order to board the buses.
Thank you. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. If there are no further questions, have a great night, and we'll look forward to seeing you in a little over a week. And thanks, Tess, for joining us, as well as Mark and Jack for running the program here.
Thank you guys. Have a good night.
Good one.
Thank you for the session. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Was so interesting. Thank you.
So, okay.
Thanks a lot, Miyoki. This is good.
Thank
What do
you
you
guys so much. If you guys can share the recording with me, I
Yeah,
would
of
love
course.
that. We may have had like 2 or 3 students who missed the session tonight. I just want to make sure that they have this
Okay.
information.
I can also send you the full participant.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, because there were a few
People
students
came
who
and went.
came on after. Yes. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Do you need my email address, Jack, to
I
look
think
at?
I have it. I'm on some of the emails with Mark.
Okay, perfect.
Okay,
Great.
good. Thanks a lot. Thanks for
All
organizing
right.
it.
I'll see you guys next
Great to
week.
see you. See you
See ya.
next week.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah.